You're listening to the Kaiju Apostle Podcast, a Godzilla podcast for hardcore and casual fans alike, and everyone else in between.
For tuning in to another episode of the Kaiju Apostle Podcast. My name, as always, is David, and joining me, as always, is the sublime Chris Hormskirch. How are you doing, Chris?
Well, now that we've changed this to a Godzilla ASMR podcast, I am doing very well, and I think that our listeners are about to be in for a treat as well.
Yeah, we upgraded our microphones to the ones that have like the dual ear things. Like that's actually that's a rabbit hole we don't want to go down. Your microphone sounds a lot better tonight, Chris. What did you do to improve that?
Well, I went to Best Buy despite all of my misgivings, all of my feelings against Best Buy, which I usually call an Amazon showroom. And I bought a cord that I suspect actually works, unlike the one that I had been using.
There we go.
So now you'll get my voice in whatever the vocal version of high definition is.
Yeah, it was so weird going from our last podcast where this is how it sounded for the most part, right? And then when we started this again, everything just sounded so rough on your end. I'm just like, I don't know. I was like, I kind of remembered it wrong. Just assumed that was the case. So it's kind of nice that we can get back to sounding a little bit more professional. And now, we'll get sponsored by NPR and Mountain Dew Game Fuel and all that. So I'm pretty excited. I think there's big things for us on the horizon.
I know, it's kind of crazy once we get to our commercial break halfway through the episode, when we have to beg and plead for the archaeology review to give us their spot back, just to be followed up by Mountain Dew, which I think is just going to be 3 long explosions in a row, which they call an ad. And then NPR, where we just kind of whisper for the next 30 seconds. I don't know.
Yeah, pretty much.
I'm really excited for a lot of changes coming to this episode.
Me too. Before we dive into the movie, though, I just wanted to bring attention to a few things. We did get our first review on Apple Podcasts, so Zimzilla99. That was awesome of you to do that. So really appreciate that. So if you guys do enjoy the podcast, please, if you wouldn't mind doing that, it you believe it or not, it may not seem like a big deal, but those do help people feel confident enough to invest their time into a new podcast.
Especially since that wasn't a dinky review either. That was actually
No, not at all.
Pretty substantive. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, that was actually pretty, for our first review. That was awesome for sure. But I wanted to also bring attention to the fact that we do have some awesome intro and outro music. So this is in the description on all of our episodes and all that, but I wanted to bring attention. So Evan Handyside, according to Google, is self-employed guitar teacher in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with 25 years experience. Performed throughout the Northeast as a bass player for the Pittsburgh-based alt-rock band New Invisible Joy. Band has released 4 albums on their indie label Goldbush Records. But Evan is a awesome guy to follow on Instagram, subscribe to YouTube, all that. But I found him a year or so ago because he does some classical renditions of a few Godzilla songs. So when it was time for us to find music for the podcast again, you know how we had that classical version of Across the Stars for our last podcast, which is still probably like my favorite piece of Star Wars music ever. So I was like, why don't we do that again? And when I hit Evan up, he was just like, oh yeah, absolutely. Like he was all on board for allowing us to do that, it was so the songs from Shin Godzilla, which we'll see here in a couple years.
Right, we still have to go through Torso Godzilla and Leg Godzilla, and then we can get to Shin Godzilla.
Yeah, but Femur Godzilla, oof, that's a good one.
That's the hardest one to break, I hear.
Yeah. But then Owen goes by Hausu Goji on Instagram. He did the very ambient sounding version of one of his songs. I can't even remember what it's. I think the Monster Zero March. But he did that. He was more than happy to let us use that. So all of their links and all that are in the description for the podcast. You can always go to Kaiju Apostle, thekaijuapostle.com, and click on an individual episode if you can't find it easily enough. But just please make sure you support them as well. They're allowing us to use that music free of charge. We've made sure to credit them and obviously the original artists, but we wanted to do something that we could showcase someone else's work instead of just some generic royalty free music that we could do. So I wanted to make sure to give them a shout out. So jumping right in, we are discussing Mothra, released in 1961, and one of my personal favorite movies in this entire scope of what we're doing. So before we really get into all the nitty gritty and all that, just so you're aware, Chris, and people who are listening, you probably know already. So, of course, director is Ishiro Honda. Past few films, apart from Godzilla Raids Again, he's had his hands in. I would wager, before we get into it, this is probably a much more favorable experience for you than Varan. I would say most people would agree. Cast-wise, we do have Frankie Sakai. He plays Senshiro Zen, as we'll refer to him. So Senshiro Fukuda. And then we have Hiroshi Koizumi, who plays Dr. Shinichi Chujo. He is someone that you will see quite often down the road. And then we have Kyoko Kagawa. She plays Michi Hanamura. And then we have, oh man, like it's hard for me to say this, but probably my favorite character, Jerry Ito, plays Clark Nelson. But those are our four major characters. And then, so, Shiro Honda's director again. But the music is a little different this time around. Instead of Akira Ifukube, we get a Yuji Koseki. Apparently, so the Shobijin in this film, the Tiny Beauties, I don't know if you knew this, Chris. So they were a popular musician group at that time called the Peanuts. And Ifukube was a little concerned about writing music for him, so he didn't feel confident in scoring this film. So that's why we have a different composer this time. But this film actually, there was an original story that was commissioned for this film. So we had a couple writers. They all came together. They wrote a story called The Glowing Fairies and Mothra, which was then serialized in a magazine in 1961. And then that's where we get this movie. Is a little bit different than normal. So we had that original story, but then of course we get we get Shinichi Sekizawa, who also did the screenplay for Varan. And like we talked about last time, he really starts changing the tone of these films. Mm-hmm. So just kind of a little bit of context and all of that, so you kind of know who's who. But yeah, what were your initial thoughts, like going into it, even before watching the film? Because obviously you kept making all the moth memes, so obviously you had some point of reference for this.
Yes, this time I was aware that the monster was a large moth, and I had assumed, based on the past films, that we were going to be watching another, well, this is just a giant version of a monster from real life. You know how they're normally 2 feet? What if they were 200? And so I was like, okay, so Mothra stands to reason, probably loves lamp. And we all know from late 2018, there was a grand 1.5 weeks when Mothra memes are all the rage. And then they flew in the sun, and I've not seen one since. But because I still make Harambe jokes on purpose, unironically, I will have to make a few moth memes, hopefully.
That'll be allowed.
Thank you. I think Harambe would really appreciate that too.
Okay, so yeah, you had a little bit of context going into it because I think you hear the word Mothra, the name Mothra, you're like, okay, it's a moth, right? So, but yeah, going into the film, I guess after watching Varan last week, what were some of your thoughts going into this? Like, were you excited? I mean, this is kind of how I want to start going about this too, is kind of hearing your initial thoughts, and obviously we'll get into the movie, but just kind of hearing where you're at before starting it.
I think between the past couple, like the last two being not really Godzilla, but just kind of generic monsters, more or less. Like this could have gone either way, because Varan felt like a rip-off version of Godzilla, like the dollar store version that you buy in the DVD section. Which I guess I can't say that because there's Ultraman DVDs at Dollar Tree now, so they're getting some good stuff. But I was kind of like thinking, okay, this could either be like a ripoff of Godzilla or it could be doing its own thing. I genuinely don't know yet. And thankfully it did its own thing and had its own some of its own pretty good points. And
yeah,
I think when I started to see that there were going to be more villagers, I was like, oh no. Because I mean, we'll get into this a little bit later, but that was one thing that I've been a little more nervous about as time has gone on in terms of how they've treated the natives. And so, I don't know. This one I was a little more I know everyone likes it, and I really paint with a broad brush when I say that. But there was just kind of maybe coming from Varan, I was a little more nervous than I should have been. But in the end, I really actually enjoyed this one a lot more. And
well, I'd hope
well,
so.
yeah, I guess what I was about to say is, well, compared to Varan, I would probably enjoy getting hit by a bus too. But
oh, geez, yeah. Yeah, the whole villager aspect, it's tough, right? Because my wife and I were actually just having a conversation about this of like stereotypes in car sales. You don't want to perpetuate those stereotypes, but unfortunately there are some truth to these things, right? So how do you acknowledge that truth without perpetuating a harmful stereotype? And I think that's the difficulty of dealing with islanders and villagers in any film at all, right? Because on the one hand, yes, there are Aboriginal communities in the world, but how do you portray them in a way that's not just savage and so otherly, right? Because for a fact, in all these situations, they're thinking the same thing. Like, who are these barbarians showing up? Not that they have that word, but there's always the fear of the other is always a very real and present temptation. But I do feel like, at least with this film, there's a lot more humanity than maybe where we were with like the last one, only because, first of all, we didn't get a chance to really know the villagers in Varan, right? But we also have the Shobijin standing in as a medium to speak for their behalf, right? But of course, the tribal, all that stuff is just kind of, it's hard to really put a finger on. Like, I don't know, for me, anytime they do the rituals and stuff, I'm like, I know there are rituals like this, but I'm like, is this problematic? I don't really know how to feel about this. I'm like, do people really wear bikinis like this? And I'm like,
well, and that's part of where the difficulty comes in. And of course, speaking as a straight white man, straight white cis man, I am not an expert on this subject at all.
Yeah.
But there's one thing to say about writing an experience that's not yours, that's a real experience. So like how they chose like Pacific Islanders or Hawaiians from a certain year, but weren't Pacific Islanders or weren't Hawaiian, that would definitely be problematic. But there's almost something like there's a different degree of difficulty when they're made up villagers,
Yeah.
because then they become a pastiche of stereotypes rather than being based out of a certain culture.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no representative for fake cultures to step in and say this is problematic. So you do get a little more free reign to indulge yourself in some of your worst instincts, really.
Yeah. But I will say, if I remember reading it right, when I was going through David Collat's book on this film, well, his book about all the films, but reading the chapter on this, Sekizawa actually was in the military as well and did spend time in the South Pacific. So apparently that's why he keeps coming back to this, as we'll see in other films. So I don't know if that's good or bad necessarily, but it is a real thing
Sure.
that like he has some point of reference. But so yeah, I mean, it is one of those things where I'm like, I can't put my finger on it. The older I've gotten, I'm just like, it's not the worst thing I've seen, and it's not the crux of the film. But then I'm just still like, I don't want to watch this and like perpetuate that this is okay to my son either, that you can just like simplify people down to, I don't know. That's what kind of sucks about these villagers, apart from obviously the Shobijin, is like they don't have a voice, right?
Right.
The fairies, as Jasper calls them, that's their voice in this film. Later on, that changes. So, but just in this one, I feel like it's kind of growing pains.
Yeah.
So okay, so the film itself, though, setting the context like right off the bat, whereas Varan was just this generic monster on a loose film, we're in a world that's been affected by radiation, but it's normalized now, right? Like it's something that people are just readily not okay with, but like that's just, it is what it is. It's like, okay, we're going to be caught between a typhoon and radiation. They're saying it as if it's like commonplace. So that right there, I think, sets the tone a lot different than Varan did, where you would never know it's a post World War II film, and they made it that way. I get that. You can't really judge a film for what it's not intending to do. So, this film, it's so different compared to Varan, because right off the bat we get Zen, right? Like he is a wonderful comedic actor. Like that's what I love about this film so much, is like it I know it seems silly, but like there is a heart to the comedy, right? It's the reason why I like John Mulaney, which there's a John Mulaney reference I'll have later in this episode. But like, it's not just Dane Cook comedy, right? Or Daniel Tosh comedy. Like there's heart and soul behind the way he brings that character to life. Like he absolutely steals the whole show, like the whole movie. I mean, Mothra is the star, but I want more Zen. Like he is the reason why I love this film so much.
Yeah, there's definitely something where I don't know, the actors have been given a little more room to have fun, I feel like. And we pointed out I think it was in the last one, where there was a little humor, but it kind of sat a little funny. This time the movie definitely needs that. This movie definitely needs the comedic relief.
Yeah.
But it's not Jar Jar stepping in poop. It's not someone getting smacked over the head with a chair or a piano.
Or general hugs.
Right. This is something where we've actually gotten we're stressed. We need a little of that relief. Especially because we're starting, like, for me, who's watching all of these movies now for the first time, right? I'm like starting to get into this world where I'm like, okay, so how many movies am I going to watch where there's another new monster? It's kind of getting stressful.
A lot.
What?
A lot.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. So there's kind of this like weird like feeling that I'm getting watching these movies where I'm like, oh, another freaking monster, another monster. Like, Godzilla shows on like the first one shows on a kind of a national level what the cost of war is. But now we're seeing like, oh, the cost of war is humongous. It's not just one monster. Yeah. It's not just one nation. It's like all of these ancient beasts are waking back up, And it's not just like once in 1946 one monster woke
Mhm.
up. Like we're gonna be dealing with this for decades.
Yeah.
So with all that meta picture, it's nice to have someone having a little fun in the movie.
But so it's interesting you bring that up because with Rodan, and I'd mentioned this in the Rodan episode, but with Rodan and Mothra, neither of these monsters there's no explicit mention that they are the way they are because of radiation, right?
Yeah, sure.
So the only reason people even know about Mothra is because they had the Rolisican, government bombed Infant Island. They didn't realize people actually lived there. So when these people got stranded there and were rescued by the natives, right, they were given the red juice and they were cured, or at least not hurt more. They're like, oh, well, there actually are people here, so they go and they discover it, right? If they wouldn't have taken the Shobijin, like, never would have known about Mothra at all. But that's the thing, like, they're stepping onto a world that had existed for however long before nuclear weapons were ever a thing. So in my head, I'm like, is Mothra even a monster? Right? In the way that we've been viewing monsters, where it's not something necessarily we've created. Now we've unleashed it. So it makes me wonder, like, what role Mothra really plays in the world. Godzilla is a fruit of our hubris, right? Of our selfishness, our greed. Mothra just is. And that's when I wrote that article on Theodicy. Like, there's just sometimes evil just exists. And it's nothing that we've ever done, but it's there. So now we have to decide what to do about it. Not that Mothra is evil,
Yeah.
but just that realization that there are monsters in the world and they're present. So instead of spending time of, trying to theorize why they exist, really the proper response is, what are we going to do about it?
Well, and that's the thing. I'm glad you pointed out that Mothra isn't really the villain in this one, because not only is she portrayed like she's portrayed as their deity, which makes sense because even in 2020, right next year, if a giant 300-foot monster showed up in the middle of Kansas City or in the middle of Chicago, I'm sure a lot of people are going to find themselves a new god, right?
Yep.
Even in 2020, when we're so rationalistic, post-enlightenment, postmodern, like, we're going to become, if we're not already, we're going to find a new religion. So
yeah, but I mean, we've got the Church of MAGA, right? I mean, not to get super political in this podcast, but like, I have family members that before Trump was elected, they're like, I will never vote for this guy. And then weeks later, they're bowing at his altar pretty much. Now, like, you question anything he does. So, but I mean, it's a cult of personality, but just the point is, like, yeah, people will latch on to anything to worship. So you're right. If a huge monster appeared, you better believe there would be people who would start worshiping it, in the same way that, like, any major film where something like this happens, there's always contemporary films, if there's a giant monster, there's always people with signs like, don't kill the monster, like, and they'll have signs like, trying to talk about, like, starting a church around it. Like, it's a very real temptation.
Well, but you say you don't want to become political on the podcast, but Mothra is a fairly political film. There feels like a lot of talk about capitalism and exploitation.
Oh, absolutely. I really don't want to get into contemporary politics.
Yeah, you
too
just
much.
don't want to talk about Trump.
No. Oh boy, that's a whole can of worms right there. Whole can of Mothra larva right there that I've regretted already opening up, and I don't have any alcohol here. So water it is.
Well, and it's just, we go back to thinking like Mothra as their deity. She's not portrayed as a vengeful god. So we talked in the last episode that when they pissed Varan off, he came in and just wrecked the village. He ate everyone, and still the priest was like, forgive him. But
yeah,
that wasn't really based on something that Varan was owed or deserved. Like, Varan wasn't like just having a bad day. they were always afraid of him. They were always scared. But in this one, like toward the end, right, they trust that Mothra is going to work in their favor benevolently.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing a shift in there's two shifts, right? There's the first one in how are the monsters portrayed? Is there the possibility that they could be the hero? And then they're portrayed differently, as in, can human beings relate to them on a positive way? Is there like a mutual benefit that there can come out of a relationship with the kaiju? And this film
Mm-hmm.
seems to say, no, they can be good. Just as like dogs today can be good, so can kaiju. Just because they're big doesn't make them automatically evil. And then we can say, and there's benefits to getting to know them, which puts it
Yeah.
in a cool meta conversation with the first Godzilla movie when they're like, well, don't just kill him because he's big. And now Mothra is like, yeah, see, it's not worth just killing them right away.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing with Gojira, Dr. Yamane, and Henry. I know as soon as I said that, you're going to know why I purposely said that. He was like, hey, like, there's a benefit here, right? Like, we could be studying how to be cured of radiation. And that was actually something that, David Collette brings up in his book, where it's like with, and for the record, I like that we don't have to go through the movie chronologically. We can bounce back and forth. David Collette brings up the fact that, like, Nelson focuses so much on the commercialization of the Shobijin, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like, he misses the biggest source of revenue he could have, is the fact that there is red juice here to help keep people and cure the radiation, and he just ignores it. Like, that
yeah,
right there
fair.
would have done such wonders in the world. He could have been, even as corrupt as he is, he could have done a good thing and still make boatloads of cash, and he misses it just because he wants to exploit and subjugate two tiny women that didn't ask for it, right? And then not only that, but as a result, thousands of people die, more than Godzilla kills, right? I would argue that Mothra kills more people in this film than Godzilla ever did in the first film. That's what's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I'm watching it, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, completely lays waste to two different cities, and like is so ambivalent about the entire thing. Like, Mothra could not be bothered by what she's doing.
Right. That's a good point too.
But as a side note, you said bad day with Varan, and made me think of have a new book called Varan and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. And if I was good with Photoshop, I would totally do that, but I'm not. So
that's awesome.
Oh, I hate myself sometimes. Okay. But yeah, you're right. The film it's a very strong critique against capitalism and what exploitation can actually do. And in a way, I mean, this is still very contextual. David Collette says that, America, right? So Realistica is, first of all, a combination of Russia and America. There's no way around it. But American capitalism is very individually minded, right? Whereas the Japanese at that time, and still do, they have a very communal value in things. And we see that where, at first, Realistica is like, no, let Nelson do his thing. We're not going to step in. But then when do they step in? Whenever Mothra starts going towards Newkirk City, right? That's when they're like, oh, no, can't be coming here. Like, what does that sound like? It sounds like World War II, where it's like, hey, you guys are going to do your thing, but wait, we get bombed. Oh, no, we're going in.
Go.
Right? And so is it super explicit? Not necessarily, but it's also not, it's not super veiled either,
Right. Well, there is something to say that when they step in is when the center of commerce is threatened, but not when human life is threatened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, human life is threatened, but also with the two women, they don't really care much about that. But when economic realities might be under fire. Oh gosh. Oh no. Or it's like the meme, like the human lives are at stake, I sleep. Money is at stake, I awake.
Yep. But I mean, we all have our blind spots, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you'll see people where they care less about actual humans getting hurt, but then you see a video of a dog getting hurt and they freak out, and they're about to go ape poop on everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the thing. We have our blind spots and our prejudice. Just obviously, the Japanese dealt with America's blind spots and getting a bomb dropped on them. Not that Japan was innocent in this. Like, I feel like I hate that I even have to clarify that, but I'm like, I think that's kind of the point these films make, is like, it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. There's no justification for what happened. And, you're left with a country that will forever be scarred by that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's no going back from that. And I do appreciate that about this film, though, where, I mean, they really do try to show like a post-World War II society that's really trying to progress from that, but they're still dealing with that daily, like, people are still sick and they're still suffering. And even in the middle of nowhere, they land on an island that's radiation stricken,
Mm-hmm.
right? They can't get away from it. So character-wise, like, how did you feel about the characters as a whole? So obviously Zen, he had that good, comedy, but I feel like he was a good moral compass too, right? I mean, we see when the editor, Takashi Shimura, which I told you, these characters keep doing new roles and I love it. I want more of him. When he's like, why wasn't this a story? Why didn't you say something about the Shobijin, right? And he's like, well, no, because if I would have done a story, then people would have gone to take advantage of them, right? He was trying to prevent people from going there and doing that. Like, that right there is like, he goes from like this guy that's always trying to get the scoop to being like, no, the scoop isn't worth this.
Right.
Like, that was awesome character development. I watched that again. I'm like, oh, wow. Like, that's, to me, I don't know. It was cool. So, like, how do you feel about the other characters, though, with like Chujo and then the photographer, Hanamura, and then obviously Nelson? Like, how did you feel as a whole, like, these characters work compared to previous films?
Yeah, I don't know if I would necessarily say, well, you just said comparison, you didn't say contrast. I definitely am, the more I'm watching it, I'm like, this is like, Mothra just happens to be there at some points. This is a real human drama.
Yeah.
And I know we say this in so many posts, we say this in so many episodes. Like, I think we're batting 100 or whatever a good baseball average is. Like, these are movies about humans, and there are monsters who happen to also be in these movies.
But that's when it's a good film, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, I counted 46 minutes. Mothra finally appears. 46 minutes.
There's something about the pacing, and this is a side tangent, but it's somewhat related. There's something about the pacing of older movies where nowadays everything has to be an action adventure film, no matter what it is, no matter what genre it is. It has to be a fast-paced action, blistering speed. And back in the 90s, like, in all three Power Ranger movies, they don't morph for like 40 minutes. But we were still entertained getting there, right? Whereas you think like Force Awakens, Han doesn't appear for 40 minutes, but it feels like it's 15 because of the speed at which all the scenes move.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, the older Star Wars are definitely more evenly paced, I would say.
oh yeah, there's plenty of more sitting and talking scenes. And there's something that I really appreciated about this one. And of course it's not dealing with modern issues, and it's anachronistic to say that it was dealing with like fake news, right? But there's something I appreciated to the even-handedness of showing how the news needs news to survive, to be viable economically. But to see him to still say, no, the money, the prestige isn't worth the human cost.
Yeah.
And today in our fake news, like, or even if I want to back off, because we kind of mentioned we don't talk about Trump all the time. Think about how many times in the Twitter sphere reporting news is skewed because we try to do it sooner and we try and do it faster. Like,
Yep.
I'm thinking, to use an example out here, about 20 minutes north of me, there's a guy who drove an SUV through a mall and just kept bowling through kiosks. And it caused it, like, all the cops had to come in, shut down the mall, evacuate. But on Twitter, people are reporting like shots fired and all of this speculation on where he got his car from. Or it turned out he just drove his car through the doors from the parking lot and drove through. But all the speculation about guns and all the speculation about, oh, he stole one of the floor models that just sits in the middle of a mall. Like, something about this hesitancy to post at all this news story and the way that we have to post the second anything happens before we figure out what's happening. I felt like that was kind of a cool incidental critique.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But that's the same thing with the movie though, right? I mean, we want everything immediately. We don't know how to appreciate a well-crafted story or film. Not that what you're talking about, I don't know how to drive, stupid guy. I mean, not that that's a good story, but that's one of the funny things with like Godzilla 14, the one film that you have seen. I mean, people like to rip that into shreds because they're like, well, you don't see Godzilla until this and that. I'm like, yeah, but one of the best films, blockbuster films of all time, Jaws, like that is what a slow burn should look like. And these films do a great job at doing that, in my opinion. So I get you. I mean, we want this immediate, just action, action, action. We want it right away. And I'm not a fan of that. So I appreciate a film like this that takes its time to tell a good story.
And I'm curious too, because like, if we want to kind of talk about modern movies, you think about Cloverfield, and I'm only talking about the first one right now. Not the sequels or however many there were, right? Just the first one. Like,
there's 3. You have Cloverfield, 10 Cloverfield Lane, which was a phenomenal movie, and then Cloverfield Paradox, which is a movie.
Sure.
Right.
And I just think about how in Cloverfield we think it's beautiful. We think it's such a stroke of masterpiece that we don't see the monster except for like really just kind of fleeting glances for a while. And then, of course, when they made the toy, you know, it's an exquisite detail that we see every aspect of the monster. But when we're only getting like found footage, glimpses of the monster, we love that. But when it comes to Godzilla, it's like, get that lizard in the city now.
I know.
And I'm just curious what the difference is. Is it an expectation on the Godzilla franchise that makes us think that way? Is there something about Cloverfield that will let us forgive what we hate in Godzilla? I don't know.
Yeah. I think part of it, and this is my attempt to not be ageist, but I think a part of it is with the Godzilla fandom, there's a lot of younger fans, which is awesome. But a lot of those younger fans have started with the films where Godzilla is a little bit more prominent, where there's more action, right?
Sure.
Because there is a legitimate shift towards that. I mean, it's undeniable. It's a thing. So I think when you have the people who grew up on those films, that's what they love and that's what they want. So they project those desires onto these films, and then they forget that, or maybe they just not necessarily forget, they just don't want to acknowledge, which this is the goal of the podcast, right? To try to get people back to that, that these films didn't start that way, where these films aren't about the monster fights. These films are about humans, and there's monsters in the film. So when you go to like the Universal films, like, you know, Dracula, Frankenstein, all those films, like, yes, the monsters are a part of it, but like they are a piece of a much larger puzzle. And that's why I think those films are so iconic and they will never go away. I mean, obviously the old Universal films are like the 20s and 30s, right? And people still watch them. And that's why with these Godzilla films that just got released on Criterion, I think that's why we saw these releases compared to the later films, because these films here set the standard for everyone else. You know, we got the Ultraman series out of this, Gamera came out of this, right? And then all of a sudden now, United States, they want to do their thing. And because I think they really like, you saw such a powerful way of making a film where the humans are truly the focus of the film. If not like in this film, like the real monster is Nelson.
Mhm.
This is the first film that I feel like we actually get a real villain, but like he's still likable. That's what I love about it. Like, so he is Japanese American, if I remember right, but like he didn't actually speak Japanese, if I was reading all this, so he says everything phonetically, which makes sense why his Japanese is a little bit
Oh, I
different.
was really curious about that. I was wondering if it was like an acting choice.
Yeah, so apparently he didn't actually speak Japanese, so that's why when he gets angry he yells in American English towards the end, which I thought was funny. But yeah, so I just, we actually get a villain here, right? Like he is the real monster in this. That's what I think is so, you definitely see that shift of, you'll start seeing this in more films where you see more characters like him, where the monsters stop being the monsters and we start seeing, even in the original Gojira, who is the real monsters, right? Is it the sleeping dinosaur that gets radiated and it wasn't his choice, or is it the people that decided that nuclear bombs is the only way, the next viable option, civilians and casualties be damned, right? We're just going to drop these nukes, which I understand it's not that simplistic. It wasn't just let's just do this, but like, I mean, everyone, I mean, there's just so much in that. So that's where we start seeing in here, like I said, it's a shift. And I think that's what makes this movie so impactful, is like, I mean, Mothra is obviously a part of it, but like the film stands not on its own, but they're not also like competing against each other. Right. Like you could watch the film and like, I've seen people like, well, can you even remember a person, like a human, out of these Godzilla films? I'm like, yeah, every single one I watch. Well, almost all of them that I watch. Like, but this one here, I mean, like Chujo, he's an awesome scientist. Like, I love how he's so hesitant to even get involved. Right. But then like he's like, it is kind of funny. You always get these scientists that like have no real relation. They just get pulled out. Like it came from a Movie Monster podcast was talking about that on their 98 Godzilla episode, where he's the bug guy, right? And he gets pulled out to help that. And in the original Godzilla, it's Dr. Yamani's just this random, well, kind of random scientist that they pull in. It's always someone random. But Hiroshi Koizumi is such a affable character. Like he starts out seclusive, but then by the end of it, like he's also one of those moral compasses, right? And then you have Mishi, like, I don't know, she's a strong woman character. So they're all enjoyable characters that help complement the monster. It's not a either or, it's a both and to me.
Yeah. But I think in this one too, I kind of had the thought like, well, in some senses, the kaiju are just as much a character. They're not treated, some movies don't treat them as like a kaiju. They're like, this is Mothra. Mothra has desires. Mothra has agency. Mothra wants to see something happen. But do you remember when we watched Rodan, where I kind of suggested that Rodan, the two of them acted the way the two of the humans should have at the beginning?
Yeah, I remember you were kind of teasing it out. Yeah.
Yeah, so like remember at the beginning the humans were fighting, but then the two Rodans were like living in harmony, like in love with each other type thing. And this is where this really comes to bat. Like Mothra is treating the women better than the humans are. The humans should be protecting them. The humans should not be exploiting them. The humans should not be bringing them from their homes. But it's up to Mothra to be the one who says, well, just like what Isaiah would say, Mothra looks down to see who would help, and seeing no one, Mothra herself goes down to save them.
Yeah. So if we're going to get into theology, though, let's get into that, because this is probably the first film where I feel like it's explicit. First of all, when Zen does the sign of the cross, it was like way too many points, man. That's
Yeah.
way too many.
A couple of crosses.
Yeah. But yeah, this is like the first film where we see like Catholic priests, right? That was interesting. You know, the cross on the church, and which gives the heroes inspiration. And the version I watched, the English subtitles, you know, it's like, you know, leave it to the grace of God, right? And it was a capital G, which was interesting. But I actually find that this movie's portrayal of Mothra is not great. Like, I was actually a little bothered by it. So I don't know if it's explicit or it was intended, but we already talked about how like Mothra killed more people, I think, than Godzilla did in the original film, right? So obviously the Shobijin have been captured. Mothra is going to rescue them. And what's interesting is, you know, when they're performing, you know, they're singing their song, right? And they just think like, oh, they're singing a song. But so the lyrics, if I remember right, it was so it was like originally in Indonesian, I think, and then translated into Japanese. But the lyrics are Mothra, oh Mothra, if we were to call for help over time, over sea like a wave, you'd come, our guardian angel, right? So like right there, you know, they're singing like, hey, like come rescue us, and they don't even realize like what's actually happening. You know, they don't recognize the prayer. But the issue I have here is Mothra is just so indiscriminately like killing people, right? Innocent people that didn't ask to be killed. And I understand he's trying to rescue his people. The issue is what pacifies Mothra, what gets Mothra to calm down. Eventually it's the music and all that, right? But it's the cross. And to me, that brought back this idea that like there's an angry God that's just killing and just doing whatever it needs to, but then all of a sudden it sees the cross and it's pacified. Like this idea that Jesus has to step in to stop the angry father. Right?
Well, it's not even like step in, he has to like sneak in.
Yeah.
It has to be like, hey, what's that over there? And suddenly he's on Earth being like, okay, shoot, we got one chance at this.
Yeah. But do you see what I'm saying? That like I was watching that and I'm like, oof. it just reminded me so much of like I mean that's a pretty common view of Christian theology. So, or at least, you know, the atonement theory. And it just kind of made me wonder like if that's what was intended to be, right? Whether it's like that's how God is, or you know, there's so much left unknown. But I was watching that, I'm like, man, that's uncomfortable for me, because obviously that's not how God is, right? You know, God and, you know, the Father and Son are not pitted against one another. You know, it's not the blood of the Son that stops the Father in his wrath. It's the fact that the Father gave up his own life in the Son to redeem humanity. But, you know, again, this film isn't necessarily trying to present atonement theology. I don't know, the way that Mothra just like, again, so many people just die. And I'm not saying like the two Shobijin aren't worth it, but I'm like, was there not another way? You know, like what?
Right.
It just makes me wonder, like, you know, were our human protagonists not capable of truly saving them? Is that what happens? And so it's hard for me to be like, oh, like this happy ending, and I'm like, and families were ruined forever. Like we talk about Power Rangers, right? We don't think about like all the destruction, the economic havoc it wreaks on all these communities. We're just like, oh, dudes in suits, big monsters, Power Rangers. Yeah.
Well, say what you will about like Batman versus Superman, but the movie being predicated on the fact that that Superman and Zod happened to fly through this one building rather than the one next door. Like, whatever you want to say about the movie, and preferably the less the better, really, but it does deal with that fallout of indiscriminate destruction in a way that I'm curious to see if we'll see a little bit more in this franchise.
Yeah.
But I do think there's something to be said about like, you know, when you talk about Christian theology and theodicy, you'll be like, okay, well, why doesn't God do anything about evil? And then sometimes the answer is like, well, you do understand who causes evil. Like, you do understand how many evil things you've done today, let alone in your entire life, right? Like,
Yeah.
had God just stepped in to take care of evil, it'd be a flood again, right? So
Mhm.
maybe there's an idea where the humans probably should have been the ones to free the women, because when Mothra has to do it, it's not pretty.
No,
So
for sure.
there's a call for us to maybe do it a little bit more cleanly. And I don't know. Of course, what we read Christian theology into these movies is absolutely reading into and projecting onto them. And we're hoping that maybe they had some inkling of a similar idea, so we couldn't
Yeah.
be completely eisegeting the films. So,
Yeah, it's just this is the first one where we actually see that explicit imagery,
sure.
right? That's what's so different about it. But I'm sitting here too, and I'm like, I don't want to, we get into like victim blaming, right? But like, how responsible were the Shobijin for Mothra's destruction, right?
Mhm.
Because again, they deserve to be freed, but Mothra wouldn't have come if they didn't sing for her.
Mhm.
So it's this weird, like, it's not, to me, it's not all like bundled up nice and neat like I want it to. I'm like, oh, like I actually have to wrestle with this. Like I think of Miroslav Volf, where he talks about how, him going through and witnessing, destruction and war and I think he's Croatian, right? So like witnessing that growing up and like how that made him realize like the wrath of God is a legitimate thing, but because God loves so much that the idea of evil going unpunished is not a thing that he can do. But then does that happen in our lifetime? Is that in the life to come? Like
Mhm.
obviously I think it's a both and. Again, it's not an either or. But yeah, it's just like, oh. But what's interesting, of course, is, at the end of the film, it's ultimately when humans make peace with one another, right? That's when
Mhm.
the monster goes away. The military doesn't do jack crap. The military actually makes Mothra hatch faster. So
Mhm.
maybe that's actually a good thing.
Hey, let's just point out that these movies have been fairly consistent in that much.
Oh, absolutely, and that's all Ishiro Honda. I mean, that's definitely his thing, and I think that's why Varan was a little different. Like it still was the scientist, right? But I feel like the military played a bigger role. But it was
Yeah.
also because
Oh,
he
for
was
sure.
pitching it to American audiences. So of course he's like whatever.
Yeah. And I know, okay, so I know looking at the time, we're probably wanting to transition to questions real fast. But there's one more thing that I wanted to at least float out there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that this is our first female kaiju.
Mm-hmm.
And until we meet, I'm assuming Mrs. Godzilla to birth my favorite monster. Um, I wonder how many, like, I wonder if you could assign, of course, being directed and written in 6061, they wouldn't have the same conceptions of gender essentialism and sexual essentialism that we would, right? So I'm just curious if there's anything you could read into, like, the maternal nature of animals in her destruction, because we talk about like mother bears, they'll wreck shop when you mess with their
Mm-hmm.
cubs. Or to pull in theology, you can summon she bears to eat the youths if they're making
Oh
fun of your
gosh.
hairstyle. So
Yeah. Talk
I'm
about.
just curious if there's any reason that Mothra is explicitly female in this one, or if it's just to shake it up, or is this hinting at a Godzilla Mothra relationship down the road?
Don't. 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 Don't.
Mothzilla,
Don't. Don't.
Godthra.
We are not inviting that onto this podcast.
We are now a Godzilla shipcast.
Oh God. Good night, guys.
I'm shipping King Ghidorah's first head with Mothra.
You realize I could edit all of this out, but I won't. I won't. So really quick note before questions, though. So two things, we need to sum up our thoughts about the film. But
Mhm.
I did have to, as I was watching it, I just watched John Mulaney, a couple months ago. I've been watching his stand-up, recently. And the part where they're at, waving goodbye as the boat goes off, like, I just love his skit about that, where it's just like, do people just call up other people like, hey, what are you doing today? Let's go down and like put on our nice dress suits and just wave to people we don't know. Like it's just this weird phenomenon of like, how did this become a thing? Like maybe the first ship that ever left ever, where it's like, oh my gosh, it isn't sinking. Bye, but we're going to wave to you just in case you don't come home.
Right.
And then, yeah, it's this huge thing. I did also want to mention that the Mothra larva is bigger than Godzilla in this film. So the Mothra larva is 180 meters compared to Godzilla's like 50 meters. And then when it turns into its imago form, which is its final form, wingspan is nearly 900 feet wide and 80 meters long. So, yeah, big monster.
Yeah, you talk about the final form. Now I'm thinking of Mothra is like Frieza. This isn't even my final form.
Oh, geez. So yeah, overall scale 1 to 5, how would you rate this film?
Oh, 5.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, man.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
It's a good one for sure.
Oh, man. No. I would probably... I don't know if I'd say 5 yet.
Okay.
But I don't know,
Gotcha.
actually. No. I don't know, because what did I think was missing from it? Nothing. What did I think was wrong with it? Nothing. Am I just reticent to call any movie perfect? Probably.
No, think about it this way. If you get an A on a paper, it doesn't mean you get 100%.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's why I'm confident in giving it a 5. Like this is where I think you really start seeing like they're hitting their stride.
Mm-hmm.
Their creative team, like the effects, the writing, the direction, the way everything's shot, the music. It's just a great film. So I am very confident in giving it a 5 myself.
So what? Just like broadly, don't give me too much, but like, are the next couple going to be the same behind the scenes teams? Are we switching?
For the most part. The most part, different composers, stuff like that. I can't remember all of the films that we have next. I think we're going straight into a Godzilla film next. I could be wrong though. I'm gonna actually pull that up right now so we can talk about that later. But so questions and comments, as you're aware. Oh yeah, we're going to King Kong vs. Godzilla next time. Oh yeah. I won't make you watch the Japanese version. I meant the English version of that though. Unless you want to. So, comments, questions. We're doing this every week, every episode. Excuse me. So if you have any questions, comments you want to share, whether it's about the episode you're listening now, the next episode, previous episodes, just nothing too far in the future because Chris hasn't seen the films yet. Hit me up on Twitter, Instagram. You can email the Kaiju Apostle at Gmail. And we will share them because we actually have 6 this evening, which is pretty awesome. We were going to have...
If I can interrupt real quick. Like, submit whatever. Like,
yeah,
David will filter them. And if you've got a good question that has a spoiler in it, we can suss out the question without spoiling it. So please, like, submit whatever you'd like. And worst case scenario, we put it in the tank for that episode.
Yeah, I do have a question that's for actually next episode. So as long as it's relevant, I'll put it in there. Just please make sure it's safe for work. I mean, obviously, we're doing our best to be a podcast that's remotely family friendly, which, okay, really quick though, this is supposed to be a family-oriented film, and I realize family-oriented films in the 60s is much different than now.
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
You have kidnapping, you have swearing. Like, yeah, I was kind of surprised by that. Going back and I'm like, oh, yeah, like some of these films, sometimes I struggle with like letting Jasper watch, to be honest. But okay, questions. So, the always lovely Henry from It Came From a Movie Monster podcast, kind of 2 questions in one. So how do you feel with Mothra leading the archetype for story settings for later Toho films? That's the first question. And then will you explore the Rebirth of Mothra series? So I don't know if you can really answer any of those. So he's not wrong because a lot of the plot beats, story beats that we see here are going to be carried into future films, obviously changed up a bit. So let me kind of take his question and make a question. right?
Mm-hmm.
Chris,
All
how do you
like.
feel? How do you feel knowing that this movie helps set the standard for future films? How does that make you feel?
If I'm being completely honest, that recontextualization doesn't give me too much more to work with, because I
Yeah, I
don't
know.
know if you mean like structure wise, theologically, monsterifically. So,
Throw me a bone, man. I'm working with what I got here.
hey, Henry, that was a great question. Do not listen to David. Thank you. I think I don't know. I think if it's like true that they're hitting their stride here, this was a pretty significant step forward. So if they
Mhm.
are using just as much character work, if they are using the monsters for a little bit more than just big bad city crunchers, I'm excited. I think this is a good standard to start from. Whereas Gojira, the first one was good, it just didn't give you much. Like, that's why Godzilla rates again was so tough, because it's like, how do you follow that up? But now that Mothra
Mhm.
is asking questions and kind of introducing some world building and suggesting that we don't have to kill the monster, yeah, I could see this being the good, like, gateway movie into a franchise. So
Yeah.
I think that's great.
Awesome. That's a good answer. Um, as for Rebirth of Mothra, yes, we will be doing an episode about that. That is one of the bonus episodes I don't mind mentioning that we're going to be doing.
I'm just, since he asked us that, Henry, are you suggesting these are bad? Please tweet me at Chris Worms.
I won't answer that.
That's why I asked Henry.
Okay.
Can I call him Henry?
Next
Are we on
question.
a first name basis?
You should be.
Okay.
Yeah, and seriously, guys, like, definitely, I've pitched his podcast so many times. I've had an absolute blast listening to their episode about Godzilla 98 to celebrate Godzilla's 65th birthday. I mean, there's so many people on the podcast, so it's like an absolute chaos, and it's wonderful every single moment of it. Okay, next question. So Jurassic _ Subby asks, what do you think of Mothra as a kaiju? Chris.
I, I compare. I don't know how to answer this the best way. So let me just answer the way that it came to my head first. Is there's something so creepy about a familiar animal being so big? Like, yeah, I've seen a lizard before, but I've never seen a Rodanosaurus or whatever. So now
Mm-hmm.
that it's a giant moth, like, there's a weird, like, this is what you know, but it's bigger. This is what you know, but it's like perverted now. How do you feel about that? And I'm like, not good. So I think it's a good choice. The memes have kind of like taken some of the fire out from under her, but there's something so, like, just as when we talked about the humans being the real monsters, like
Mm-hmm.
animals being the monsters, there's something so unsettling about that, because we're so used to one thing and now they present it so differently that I think it's great. I love it. I would love to see what the next one is. A giant cardinal, not the Catholic kind, the bird kind.
Yeah, I mean, that is good you clarified, because we did talk about Catholics this episode. So, yeah, I agree with that. I think there's something challenging about seeing something that you're so used to and you're forced to think about it differently, right? I mean, that's why when you get Godzilla, it's like, okay, dinosaurs. I mean, they're obviously not here necessarily, right? But then giant moth, and you're like, oh god, like, what would happen if there's actually a giant moth? Like,
I don't like regular sized ones.
yeah. But it is interesting seeing that, like, I think at one point in the 90s they stopped making the Trend Masters toys because they weren't selling well, because obviously for guys, Mothra's not masculine, right? And now you get all this weeboo stuff of Godzilla shipping with Mothra, and I'm like, oh god, like, this is the other end of the spectrum. I did not want this.
Well, if you didn't want Godzilla shipping on this podcast, you should not have asked me to co-host.
Yeah. Okay. Next comment comes from Christian, CA_M7A on Instagram. Praise Gojira, praise Gojira, praise the mighty Gojira. So thanks, Christian. Always appreciate you reaching out and the support. And yeah, I don't know how to answer that question because it's not a question. So if you're on Jeopardy, you would have lost. Alex collects monsters. He said may already be answered by which, by the way, Christian, I do appreciate you, but that was such a random thing to send. Alex said may already be answered by just talking about the movie, but this question is for Chris, so my heart broke a little bit. Thoughts on Hiroshi Koizumi as Chujo?
This might be one of those times where I could be stalling to pull up IMDb to make sure I'm realizing who's who.
He was the linguist scientist.
Oh yeah.
The philologist.
Yeah, I appreciated this take a little bit differently because we had mentioned previously that being a scientist automatically made you an expert on any kaiju put in front of you. But I thought this is an interesting take, and yeah, we did kind of answer this a little, and I think you summed it up perfectly. That he eventually also became a moral compass himself. Yeah, I don't know. I don't honestly have too many thoughts because this time I think I was a little more taken in my So one of my majors in college was gender studies, so I wasn't totally thinking about that aspect. I was a little more caught up on gender until this discussion, but could be one to revisit.
Well, you better get used to him because you're going to see him as an actor.
Well, maybe what I can do then is revisit this question when we've met him in a different role.
Yeah, that would be good. So Nathan, he has a podcast called the Monster Island Film Vault. Also recommend that one. His episode on the anime trilogy was quite nice. So he said, what do you think of screenwriter Shinichi Sekizawa? This was his first big kaiju film, as he had just cut teeth with Varan.
That's crazy. I never know, it's so weird to me that someone woke up one day and is like, I'm going to write a big monster movie. But this one feels like he was already kind of familiar with how kaiju movies work and knew what story beats to hit. So if this was really their first, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily obviously Varan was the big one, but it looks like
you live and learn. You make mistakes and you write a great one the second time.
Yeah, for sure. It looks like his very first screenplay was for the independently produced film Fearful Attack of the Flying Saucers, which was also his sole directing credit. And then that's when he got brought on to start doing Godzilla films. He looks like he contributed some material to the original Ultraman as well, which I'm totally on board with. That's been a fun show to watch. But yeah, I think, screenplay wise, obviously there's a lot of factors in there. I don't know all the inner workings of that, but I will say, knowing what we're going into, his scripts are some of my favorites. So I think he did a great job. Even though I think my top 5 Godzilla films, this one wants to creep in there. I really do enjoy this one so much. It hurt me to actually have to take notes while watching it. That's what's hard for me sometimes with these films. I'm I just want to watch it, right? But I don't have time to watch it and then watch it again and take notes. So I've got to do it right the first time.
Yeah.
Let's see. All right. And the last one's a comment, so not necessarily a question. Eli, Instagram is Godzilla Fan 62. To me, Mothra is the turning point of the Showa era. It is the film that brought all the pieces together to make, in his perspective, the perfect special effect / tokusatsu film. The great direction of Ishiro Honda, the craft of special effects of Aija, I actually don't know how to pronounce his name, Subaraya. I've never pronounced his first name. But he's the one that's done all like the special effects. He goes on to do Ultra Q and Ultraman. The music of Yuji Koseki, and finally the script of Shinichi Sekizawa, which we just discussed, which I think, being Eli, is the biggest part of why this film works. Think about small little people worshiping a giant moth. What a story to put into the film. Well, they did it, and now Mothra is one of the most recognizable monsters in the world. I mean, he ain't wrong.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's just talk about the fact that the movie is predicated on the fact that people, like we said earlier, that people would worship a moth. But the fact that we're watching this movie and think, yeah, that's normal. I absolutely think that would happen. Speaks a lot to the ability to sell this whole movie as a concept to us. And that is a team effort. So that is a good comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, by this point, you've kind of bought into the fact that there's giant monsters in the world, right? Like, that's actually one of my thoughts on the radio broadcast. It was like, one of the great monsters of this century. And I'm like, wait, who else is in this universe? Like, that's what's funny is up until now, you have Gojira, Rodan, Mothra, and Varan. They're all their own films, right? But then eventually they get brought in together. Like, this is the last of the kind of solo films before we start getting Avengers. Not really, because that would be horrible. Yeah, no, there's no Tony Stark in these films. But
wait, so what? I mean, when we get to King Kong vs. Godzilla: Dawn of Justice, what's that?
Well, that's next year, and that's even debatable if that film's coming out. That's kind of been my running joke, is it's going to get shipped off to Netflix, which, you know, it'll go the route of Cloverfield Paradox.
They'll just drop it and be like, oh, you should watch this, please.
Yeah, honestly, I have no idea what's going on there. It's not bothering me at all, but there's so many people freaking out about that. I'm just like, guys, like, I understand you're concerned, but I promise, like, it's going to be okay. Like, it's going to be okay. They did not spend this amount of money and cast these talented actors just to not release the film.
I mean,
like, it's not New Mutants. It will come out.
Oh my gosh, what a deep cut. I really just can't see them say, yeah, we've got Brie Larson, aka Captain Marvel, and no, we're not going to use her. No, it's going to find some.
She's not in this film, though. She's not in the film.
But isn't she in King Kong?
Yeah, but that's set in the 70s, dude.
Well, I haven't seen it. I'm not allowed.
I know. Well, I had to say that to make sense. But yeah, that's set in the 70s. It's
Wait, are you saying King
movie.
Kong hasn't seen Star Wars because it's not out yet?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I mean, he's just like, yeah, we'll get on there.
That's one thing King Kong and Hopper have in common. They haven't seen Star Wars.
Yeah. Yeah, little space wizard boy. I am exhausted, man. It is 10:36, which really it's 11:36 because of DST, right? That is not a drug, kids. But okay, so who are we gonna pour it out for this time? Because I don't feel like Nelson would be a good choice.
Really, all that's left are the civilians. So we are going to be pouring out metric tons of drinks for them.
Yeah, and the natives too. That was rough, actually. I had that in my notes. That was really rough watching the way that he just shot all the natives. So it was appropriate that that's what he saw before he died. So to all the civilians in Tokyo and New Kirk City, I always want to say New Donk City from Super Mario Odyssey.
Headcanon accepted. I can't wait for Donkey Kong versus Godzilla next week.
Donkey Kong versus Yoshi. Have a good night, guys. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Kaiju Apostle podcast. You can tune in to future episodes on most major podcast distributors, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. For more information, including music credits, please visit our website at www.thekaijuapostle.com or at instagram.com/the.kaiju.apostle. We appreciate your support and hope to hear from you soon.